I'm sure you've all seen the fridge magnets that we had made up a few years ago. There's still lots of them around. There's a Pali passage on the face of it, and the meaning of that Pali is, "Be ever mindful, Mogaraja. See the world as empty and abandon thoughts of self." This was a line from the Sutta Nipata. It's part of a long series of philosophical exchanges the Buddha had with various Brahma students. The backstory is a little bit droll, as their aged teacher had refused a favor to another Brahmin, and then he cursed him and said, "Your head will split into 17 pieces." And the old Brahmin was so afraid and upset, he took to his bed and couldn't eat or drink, and was very terrified. And he told his students to go and see if they could seek some wisdom that would help him. And he said, "I've heard of this Tathagata, the Buddha, who's staying in such and such a place now, and I've heard he's an expert on head splitting. You can go and speak to him." And they went to see the Buddha, and it's the last you hear of the head splitting. They get to see the Buddha. I guess they didn't take his anxiety too seriously, because they all had good kind of philosophical questions for the Buddha, and the Buddha answered them, and this is the bulk of the sutta. And Mogaraja was one of these students, and his question was, how can I act and proceed that I may escape from the eye of the Lord of Death? And the advice of the Buddha was, "Be ever mindful, Mogaraja. See the world as empty and abandon thoughts of self." So the question was phrased in this way: how may I escape from the gaze of the Lord of Death? Is essentially the great existential dilemma of beings in samsara, caught between the two great mysteries of birth and death, as all beings in samsara are. The Zen call this the great matter. And another way of looking at it is the question of birth and death reduces samsara to its most essential attributes. The attribute of being existent in samsara is one comes into being and one passes out of being. There's birth and death. And the Buddha himself, when he was a bodhisattva, this was the question that engaged his mind. He sought resolution to the issues of birth, sickness, old age, and death, from seeing the four messengers. And beings ignore this question to their ultimate peril. There's a passage in the Majjhima Nikaya that describes a person dying and going to the gates of hell, and Yama, the Lord of Death, questions him, and amongst other things he says, "Did you not ever see a nursing babe?" And he says, "Yes, of course I saw a nursing babe." And he says, "Did you not then think, how may I escape from birth?" And he said, "No, that never occurred to me." "Oh, you foolish man. And did you ever see a sick person suffering and lying in their own vomit?" "Yes, I saw that." "Did you ever think, how may I escape from sickness?" "No, it never occurred to me." "Oh, you foolish man." Well, same thing with an aged person and a dead person. So he neglected to make any merit, he neglected to do any good deeds, and he's thrown into the hands of the hell wardens. Mogaraja was wise enough to understand that there is a problem here. And in the Buddhist understanding, and the actually the common understanding of most people in India, at the time, and actually even down to the present time, the idea of birth and death is not a one-off. Birth is followed by death, is followed by subsequent birth. And we tend, in Western culture, we tend to see the whole process of, we avoid looking at the process of death, but the process of birth, we also don't look at it with terrible honesty. We see it, we celebrate our birthdays, make a big fuss of the day we were born, as, which is just an indication that you blew it the last time around. And there's kind of a common, for example, there's a common perception in Western culture to see the period before birth as a period of the embryo in the womb as being blissful and kind of a very happy period. This is quite different from the picture that's presented in the Visuddhimagga when it's talking about birth. When Buddhaghosa is writing about birth, he describes the development of an embryo, and he says that the period in the womb is one of great misery, and confined in a hot, dark place, and cramped. And when the mother eats some hot, spicy food, you feel like you're burning up. And when she drinks something cold, you feel like you're freezing. You know, so they had the perception of, of birth as being itself a great suffering, a terrible passage like death. And the impetus is to escape from birth and death. And these are seen as a pair, because that which is born is always subject to death. There's no exception to this rule. So Mogaraja had this understanding of wanting to escape from this cycle of samsara and not knowing the way out. And the Buddha gave him the answer, first of all, to be ever mindful. This is mindfulness is sati. And this is yet another one of those Pali words that is not clearly conveyed by the translation. And particularly in recent times, mindfulness is used all over the place. It's become trendy to talk about mindfulness, and I think is generally drifted away from the original use of the word. I know one of the senior monks in our tradition, I was discussing with him about issues of translation, and he says in his teaching he never uses the word mindfulness anymore. He says it's been so kind of debased by all these pop psychology, mindfulness things that he doesn't, he thinks people are misled by it. Sati is quality of mind that is best described as remembering to be present. Sati is the Pali version of the Sanskrit word smriti, which directly means memory. And when the Buddha talks about sati, in some places he defines it very much in relation to memory. He says, he is mindful who recalls that which was said and done long ago, easily. Who easily recalls that which was said and done long ago. So this connection to the faculty of memory is confusing to many modern students who relate it to being primarily present in the present moment. And there is that connection. Some of the older books that translated sati, some of the PTS translations used recollectedness. I think it's remembering to be present is the best way to understand it. This is clear when you have a moment of sati after being in confusion. It's common experience. You're in meditation and you've lost the thread and your mind is wandering, and then you bring it back. You suddenly remember what you're doing and who you are, where you are, and oh yeah, I'm supposed to be meditating. That's a moment of sati. It's a moment of recollectedness. It's a good exercise, particularly when you are on retreat or you're doing a fair bit of meditation during the day. But you could try it at any time. Is with the sleeping period to make the effort, beginning with the aspiration. May I catch the last breath falling asleep and the first breath waking up. And usually when people do this, they find it easier to catch the first breath waking up. And if you can wake up in that way, this is a very clear example of sati. It's like the mind turns on like turning on a switch. All of a sudden you're fully awake instantly. There's no slow kind of pulling your consciousness out of the muck, it's gradually coming awake. It's just like you're on. You know who you are, where you are, what's going on immediately, instantly. You fully recollected. If you can catch the last breath falling asleep, that's very interesting. It's harder to do, but it is a very interesting observation to watch the mind make the passage from the waking state into the dreaming state consciously. Another way of understanding this connection with memory is in the Abhidhamma, in the description of the cognitive series, which is the various mind moments that are involved in cognizing any object. It's broken down into a sequence, and it's very minutely analyzed. And depending on how mindful you are, or the reverse, how unmindful you are, the sequence can be aborted at various stages. You don't have to go through the full sequence. It only happens when you're fully mindful. You go through the entire sequence. And one of the last stages is Tadaramana, which is Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation of that is registration consciousness. So when an object is registered, it's only when the mind is fully mindful, the sequence completes to that stage and the object is registered. And it's only an object that is registered that is stored in memory. So this small practical use of this is if you're always losing your keys and your pen and whatnot, the trick is when you put them down to do that mindfully. Then you don't have to make a special effort to remember, because if it's registered, it's there in memory. If you throw it down without being fully mindful, it's not registered, it's not in the memory at all, and you have to hunt for it. And when we're trying to do mindfulness meditation, vipassana, we first of all have to be recollected. We have to remember what we're doing. We have to be consciously present. You can't be dreamy or foggy and have any success. And every object should be noticed with that clarity that brings it to Tadaramana. And when we have sufficient observation of reality with the recollected mind, with sati, then we begin to see things as they really are. Yatabhutananadasana, knowledge and vision of things as they actually are. And this is what leads to wisdom. And the most important qualities to notice are the characteristics: impermanent, suffering, and not self. And this leads to the next term in the Buddha's injunction to Mogaraja, is to see the world as empty. The world is loka, which is defined in various ways, in various places, but it essentially means the phenomenal world, the experience through the senses. In a couple of places in the Samyutta, the Buddha equates loka with the either the six senses or with the fathom-long body. So the phenomenal world is what we experience. It's not an abstraction; it's our experience. And to see the world as empty is to understand the fundamental emptiness, sunya, of all phenomena. Sunya is empty. Sunyata is emptiness. It's the noun derivative from sunya. It's the concretization of the concept. Sunyata becomes, in Mahayana Buddhism, it becomes the central theme of the teaching. But it's really, in this case, it's really just a difference of emphasis. We have in the Theravada Pali scriptures, we have references to sunya and sunyata, and that all, and particularly the statement that all dhammas are empty. All dhammas are sunya. So this is a universal principle. The passage is sabbe sankhara anicca, sabbe sankhara dukkha, sabbe dhamma anatta. All sankharas, all compounded things, are suffering and impermanent. But all dhammas, that is, all phenomena of any sort, are empty. The distinction is important because the unconditioned is a dhamma, but it's not a sankhara. So emptiness is the most universal characteristic because it applies to both samsara and nibbana. All dhammas are empty. Dhamma can be translated as either thing or phenomena or object of consciousness. It's kind of the idea of the basic unit of reality is a dhamma. Emptiness is a very important concept, and it can be a bit elusive, referring to the various attributes of reality that we classify as emptiness. Non-substantiality, non-obstructiveness, non-identification, interdependence, and so forth. The Tibetan phrase, nothing exists from its own side, is really a good summary of this idea of emptiness. The idea that no thing is self-subsistent. Everything is merely a reflection of other things. Nothing exists without causes and conditions. This is a quality of emptiness. Everything is essentially part of a process rather than a solid object. In ancient Indian philosophy, there was a concept of swabhava, own essence or own being, which is denied by the Buddha. There's no swabhava. And this is reflected in Western philosophy. There's a similar thing in Aristotle, talks about essence and attributes. That there's a substantial essence to everything, and then the core irreducible reality, and then it has various qualities or attributes. And this is in opposition to the Buddha's idea that there is no essential core reality to things. They're all empty. They're all a work in progress. They're all reflections of other things. And when you see things in this way, it's very liberating. The suffering, the level of suffering, mental suffering that beings endure from wanting things to be substantial and permanent, and satisfying is great, because you can't have that. Things are not that way. The aspect of emptiness that the Buddha talked about the most was anatta, not self. And this is the third term of the advice to Mogarajas, abandon thoughts of self. And the self can be concocted the self is an illusory idea. It can be concocted in various ways. The Buddha actually in one place talks about 20 ways of concocting a self, which is done by taking the 5 aggregates: body, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness, and multiplying them by 4. 4 times 5 is 20. Any one of the aggregates can be identified with as I am the body, or I am in the body, or the body is in me, or the body belongs to me. And the same with the other mental aggregates. You can identify with any of them in these various ways. And when we do it, these things, when we make these identifications, it automatically entails suffering, because all these things are subject, all the aggregates are subject to change and dissolution. And when there's change in an aggregate that we're identified with, then there's suffering. You can identify with the aggregate of body, and then the body is constantly subject to illness and sickness and aging. And if we identify with the body, then we're going to have mental suffering. But if we don't identify with the body, then it's just a process that we're seeing, not me, not mine. Then there's no necessity to take on that mental suffering. Same with feelings. Some people identify very much with their emotions, particularly desire happiness, some form of emotional satisfaction. And if that is had, then it's inevitably impermanent and never fully satisfying. And so there's suffering to be had from identifying with it. You can identify with unhappiness as well. There's negative form. As long as you think, I am that, then there's going to be suffering. If you're not identified with the mental states, you see them as empty and not me, not mine, and see it from a clear point of knowing, then there can be all kinds of ups and downs and changes, and the being is not affected. It's like looking at the weather out the window. And one can identify with the sankharas, the mental formations. This particular form of identification is something that I think is a bit of a issue in modern times, that the modern way of looking at the mind as a computer. If we identify with the processes in the mind, then there's inevitably going to be suffering. Because the processes are impermanent, they're changeable. It's very important for understanding the workings of the mind to clearly distinguish between the faculty of consciousness and the faculties of intention and thought. These are quite different things. And I think a lot of people in modern times get caught up in that identification with thought. The thinking is that I am the thinking. I mean, this goes back to Descartes, right? I think, therefore I am, which is a completely unwarranted assumption on his part. Even consciousness itself is not to be identified with. The knowing is empty. In the last analysis, in any mind moment, there's only two processes going on. There's the knower and the known. And as Mahasi Sayadaw puts it, the meditator comes to see there is only the object, mind arising to the object, and no third besides. The third meaning the self. There's nobody doing it. There's something being done, there's some process going on, but nobody's doing it. There's an object and there's mind arising to the object. And the object can be any one of the aggregates. It can be a physical bodily sensation, it can be a perception, a processing of a sound or a sight, or it can be a mental formation, or a thought, or an intention, or it can be a feeling, an emotional state. And this is known by the knowing mind. The knowing mind itself is empty. And it's in process. It's dependently arisen. So when you can step back from all of this and see the process as empty, abandon the thought of a self, give up the idea that I am doing this, then, as the Buddha said to Mogaraja, one escapes the gaze of the Lord of Death. In the last analysis, there is no thing that is born, no thing that dies. If you're not identified with anything at all, then when this is perfected, when this is realized even partially, then there's a freedom from the fear of birth and death. But when it's fully realized, there's a complete liberation from birth and death. This is the case of an arahant. They are removed from the process. They're not subject to birth and death. So how to apply these teachings in a practical way? Be ever mindful, see the world as empty, abandon thoughts of self. You have to be mindful to you have to have a well-developed sati to apply these teachings. So you bring mindfulness to bear, and wherever you see an identification, a holding on, a creation of a self, then break it up by knowing it. This is not me, this is not mine. Or more, that's the shorthand, not me, not mine. More fully you would say not me, not mine, I'm not in it, it's not in me. No, there is no self anywhere in the picture. And this is both internal and external. See the world as empty and abandon thoughts of self. It's an interesting reflection that the self never exists in the present moment. Even the illusory self doesn't exist in the present moment. It's always in reference to past or future. We create a self either by projecting backwards and telling our history, knowing our history. My name is such and such. That's a name we were given at one point, and I've lived so long and I've done this, I've done that, I work here, I go there. Now, this is a definition, a delineation of self in terms of past history. Or we project into the future and we see our hopes and fears, our dreams and our dreads, forward into the future, and that's seeing a self engaging in these desired or undesired experiences. But in the present moment, if it's clearly seen, there's only the object and the mind arising to the object, an impersonal process. And there's nothing to hold on to. So these are a few words on the advice to Mogaraja. Okay.